Yeah, I knew Brian Meehan had to be in his late 50s because, I mean, I covered those cases and they felt the Gilligan mob that were up.
Yeah.
Most of them went on trial, I think, for murder of Veronica Guerin. But of course, Meehan was the only one who got convicted and got the life sentence. But they were all, I mean, I would have probably been in my early 20s then, but they all felt like they were so much older. But actually, they weren't that much. He's 57.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, he was one of the, I suppose, slightly younger than John Gilligan.
Do you think as you get nearer 50, 57 doesn't seem ancient?
That old, no. And of course, like another phenomenon of people being locked up is they can sometimes, it seems to preserve them quite well.
Yeah, it's a healthy environment to live in. It can be.
It relative to, I suppose, people that are on the outside eating and drinking and whatever, they live in that life. So sometimes people can go into prison. I suppose you get good sleeps and treat.
But everyone looks after you. You've nothing to do for yourself, really.
Yeah.
Prison, I mean, that can go against you when you go to come out and you have to sort of independently live and all the rest of it. Especially lifers, which we're about to talk about. But like you have somebody who presents you with your breakfast, your lunch, your dinner, your laundry is done. You might have a bit of a job, but you kind of have to punt for that.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't think you're working or stressed out, you know, everything is looked after. Obviously there's negatives about being in prison as well.
There's huge
From
negatives.
a health point of view, funny enough, they also have really good health services. Like they say a lot of the women who go in, particularly into the DOCA centre, like a lot of women, you know, and like a lot of prisoners are in addiction, which is why they end up in criminality and going into prison. And they can get off drugs or whatever, especially women who would be pregnant going into the systems. They get really good health care, you know, and they apparently many of the time are kind of better in prison than out. But
so
Mian looks well. He's in Shelton Abbey playing golf. He's designed the golf course down there, or the putting green at least, and he's on his way out.
He's on his way out, and he has been in prison a long, long time. I suppose he now qualifies as one of Ireland's longest serving prisoners.
Mian was convicted in 1999 of the murder of Veronica Guerin. He's been in prison since then. Maybe he's been in prison a bit before that because he would have been taken into custody.
He was kept on.
So we're talking 26, 28 years he's in custody,
Yeah.
right? And the average lifer that was released in recent years served maybe 22 years.
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways to look at it, of course, and it certainly has increased. I mean, life sentence prisoners at one stage served an average of 14 years, but it has edged up in recent times. Obviously, even when they are released, they continue to be serving that life sentence and can be brought back into prison. I mean, I think the number of people serving life sentences in Ireland is something in the late 300s anyway. But yeah, Brian Meehan will be on the upper end of the people who are serving life.
So his whole 30s, his 40s and most of his 50s have been behind bars. He hasn't been a free man since he was in his 20s.
Yeah.
At the very top of his game, living it up as a member of John Gilligan's gang. They were at that time selling cannabis largely and turning over, they say, about £20 million.
Yeah.
A year, you'd be glad to know.
Yeah,
pounds.
I mean, they were the first. Yeah, if you look at it, I mean, they were the first really multi-millionaire drug dealing gang. I mean, obviously the Duns has existed with heroin before, but these were. Brian Meehan was very much a very key member of the Gilligan operation. He was in his 20s and he was making huge amounts of money along with his pal Peter Fatso Mitchell. They were heavily involved in the distribution of cannabis. I think Peter Fatso Mitchell at one stage was taken into custody and he was bragging about he was complaining about only making 40 grand that week. In particular, was one of these bizarre interviews that was given. Brian Meehan, I think, was probably, although he was always meant to have had this extreme tension with Gilligan, he was probably one of the smarter members of that gang. They had people like Patrick Duchy Holland, who was really an enforcer and muscle, but Mian was a sort of shrewd operator. But yeah, he's days of criminality are long past, I think, at this stage.
Well, I'm sure he didn't feel too shrewd an operator when he was the only one of the gang that was actually convicted of the murder of Guerin. Of course, Patrick Dutchy Holland. Mian was accused of being the driver of the getaway, of the motorbike that was used. She was killed on the Naas dual carriageway in June of 1996. She had been down to pay a fine or attend a court over a speeding ticket or something like this. Suspected that John Traynor told Gilligan that she was going to be in court that day, and arrangements were made. Gilligan was out of the country. I think he was in Amsterdam with a girlfriend in a hotel room at the time in order to or something served as an alibi for him. And Patrick Dutchy Holland was a suspected gunman. They pulled up alongside the car and sped off after she was shot dead. So Holland, from memory, was questioned.
Yes, and he was named in court.
Yeah.
He was described as the shooter in court. Now, after his release, where he was ultimately convicted on drug charges and served a lengthy prison sentence, he would continue to deny being the gunman and denied it until he passed away. But he was named in court, and that's what Gardaí believed. And there was never really any other. The suspicion never fell on anybody else. Dutchy Holland, of course, had a reputation as a gunman and had been a suspect in a number of shootings before. Had that reputation as a hitman for hire, effectively.
So what was the story about Gilligan and Mian falling out?
Well, they certainly
clashed in prison, didn't they? They were both in Portlaoise?
They were both in Portlaoise. I mean, Brian Meehan there was a younger crew surrounding Gilligan. Gilligan is now in his early 70s, so he was, more than a decade older, and he'd been a sort of armed, like a robber, like, basically. And he had these young guys working for him, young guys at the time, including Brian Meehan, Fatso Mitchell, Paul Hippo Ward, and they were kind of the younger generation. I think when they got to prison, Gilligan sort of retained that aura about him for a while. But it quickly became clear that his reputation wouldn't follow him into the prison. Now, it was always suspected that he remained, at least initially, involved in certain parts of the drugs trade. But Gilligan quickly sort of fell down the food chain. And Brian Meehan, I think, blamed him for the fact he was serving a life sentence.
He did.
Mian also had... Like all of these drug gangs, while John Gilligan was at the top, Mian had his own crew, basically, and his own people he was supplying. And he retained an interest in the drugs business in prison. He was caught with phones on a number of occasions. Certainly in his initial days, while he was behind bars, he became much more of a figure of respect in the prison, and certainly seemed to resent Gilligan. And there was constant talk of clashes and of not falling out, or of fallings out. Brian Meehan certainly, a couple of decades ago was suspected of, directing criminal operations from a cell. However, that does seem to have changed in recent
Gilligan
times.
held his own in prison, though. I mean, he did. Well, he befriended Brian Rattigan and others, and he was always able to... Gilligan has such confidence in himself and such ego that he's not going to accept any falling down any food chain. Wherever he is, he's still going to try and mentor people. He's still going to try and be the boss. And despite, his smallness and all the rest of it, he's a big personality in the room. And Gilligan did fit in as well in prison, and he had his own little fiefdom there. I think that probably Mian really resented the fact that Gilligan only got convicted on drug charges, despite the fact that it's always been, said that it was John Gilligan's gang that killed Veronica Guerin. Mian was left to carry the can, and it is a can, and that's why he's more than 22 years, the average life sentence, still behind bars. He's done another 6 because it's such a notorious case, and it was such a notorious moment in criminal history. Now, he's at a point, and the reason we're talking about him is he's in Shelton Abbey prison, and he's been moved to a kind of a singular cell sort of
they're called
apartment.
Single occupancy independent living cells is what they're described. Emma McManamy, a reporter, wrote about it for the Sunday World. But basically, these are kind of single cells that are on the grounds of Shelton Abbey, but they're kind of, I suppose, little modular units where people get used to independent living as part of their rehabilitation.
And he had his time out before Christmas. He was allowed out independently. That's a big thing. Usually when prisoners start, particularly lifers, they look for days out, and they're accompanied initially by members of the prison service who will go with them as they meet with family and friends. They can go to family events, this kind of thing. And a trust builds. And eventually when a trust builds that they'll come back and finish up their sentence, they're allowed out on their own, which is what he was granted before Christmas. But he will still need to go before the parole board for release. And that is an entity where victims can also go before and raise their objections.
Yeah.
So undoubtedly, family members, presumably Jimmy Guerin is still in contact with the parole board, I imagine, on this.
Yeah, Jimmy Guerin has spoken about it many times over the years, about not believing that this parole is suitable, I suppose. The law changed in Ireland in recent times. Previously, people, victims or the families of victims couldn't engage with the parole service. It was behind closed doors, and
they could write letters.
Yeah, but they couldn't
write letters, but they couldn't appear face to face. Now they can appear face to face.
Yes, and I think they can have access to certain documents that they weren't able to have before.
But they're still in a position, and I know this from Joey O'Callaghan, who he has had to deal with the parole board in relation to applications made by Thomas Hinchin and Brian Kenny, who were sentenced to life for a gangland murder, and he gave evidence in the cases. But he can go along. But if he writes a letter, for example, in relation to why he doesn't want Brian Kenny or Thomas Hinchin to get out, which could be very personal stuff, it goes to them.
Yeah.
They get a copy of it.
Yeah.
Which is very objectionable to victims.
It is.
And for some reason that didn't ever change. And then sometimes they're afraid to write stuff in these letters. They know that. So the one-on-one thing is better.
Yeah.
From that point of view, that they can vocalize this stuff. But the prisoners have a lot of rights when it comes to parole because they're coming near the end of their sentence. And that's how the justice system.
I suppose it works gradually over time. Initially, as you said, prisoners might be allowed to attend family events. They may get to meet somebody on the outside, often in churches, really, or say maybe for a communion or something like that. They can be brought, a Holy Communion, they can be brought to meet the family beforehand in the church, and they'll be accompanied by prison officers, driven there and driven back. But over time, if they prove to be trusted, they're given more and more freedom. But Brian Meehan, he and of course a lot of the people in Shelton Abbey, I suppose maybe half are attending training courses outside of the prison, coming back in there in the evenings, or even working
in the community or outside the community. He he's photographed playing golf.
Yeah,
he likes playing golf.
He does, by all accounts.
Yeah. And I know he's done all those years, but he does look like a guy, with a sort of a city job out on the golf course of a weekend, looking fit and healthy, and making his way back into society. And 57, I'm sorry to say, but it's still quite young.
It's still quite young. Of course, he's
new 47, I think.
I don't know. Well, he's very notorious, I suppose, and his life will never be normal. He'll never, no matter whether he gets out or not or where he goes, he'll always be known as the person who killed Veronica Guerin. So there's no escaping that, whether he's 57 or not. The restrictions on life sentence prisoners are, for example, if you got in a fight in a pub, he could be taken back into prison pretty summarily.
They're let into pubs, are they?
I'm not sure. I mean, they certainly have.
The former superintendent, John Spud Murphy, got into trouble because he was actually in a pub.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think they are, and certainly on the temporary release. But I suppose somebody who's a life sentence prisoner will be, if they granted parole, they would have a degree of freedom, but they still have restrictions, and they can be. Look, I remember writing about a female prisoner who had gotten a row in a pub. She'd been out of prison for 3 or 4 years. She'd been convicted of a killing, and she was taken back in, and she served another 4 or 5 years, because it's really up to the state to decide that you're not a threat to society when you're let out. You don't.
They have to watch the P's and Q's more than any time. Then, you recall way back John Cunningham, walking out of Shelton Abbey, on day release and never going back. But of course, he was returned and had to serve the sentence. Then you have the aforementioned Brian Kenny, who was getting release. He was actually up in
Lockenhouse.
That's the other one. Yeah, he was in Lockenhouse and he was getting day release and trusted and coming up to parole. And he went out and came back to the prison, and there was drugs found in his cell area. So he was thrown back basically into the main prison system, where you have to start again with this parole thing. I mean, prisoners themselves would look down their noses on any of those who screwed up at this point with the finish line, in view. But some of them just do.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, they wouldn't be in prison in the first place if they weren't, if they wouldn't take those crazy risks in their lives. And a lot of the smuggling that's done into prisons, obviously we've spoken about drones and all of that, but the most basic level is people who are getting day release for various reasons to then bring drugs back in, and they can make money, and so that's an obvious temptation. Look, Brian Meehan certainly was not an ideal, or what do they call it? An ideal prisoner? What's the term?
Oh yeah, I know what you're going to say. Model.
A model prisoner. So he was definitely not a model prisoner, and he was regarded as somebody who kept his hand into the drug dealing business for a long time in prison. But in fairness, that hasn't been said of him in a good long while. Maybe at 57, whatever contacts he had on the outside, or whatever people he had who he could influence, maybe they're gone and their lives have moved on. But in recent years, we haven't heard that sort of stuff about him, and he does seem to have engaged in the training courses and the things that, so it becomes an inevitability, I suppose. I mean, it's very rare people are kept in for longer than he has been.
What about Joe O'Reilly? I'm just trying to think of another. How long is he in?
Well, Joe O'Reilly was finally convicted in, I think, 2008. So you're talking. So he's
coming up to 20.
No, he'd be coming up to 17 years.
And he wasn't in custody before. No?
He wasn't in custody. He was walking in and out of the courthouse. So he's hitting that sort of 17, coming up to that 17-year period, which it's, as you said, it's complete. It's gone up. But at one stage, Joe O'Reilly, you would expect him to be coming out now at this stage. Now, Joe O'Reilly is not a gangland figure. He won't have been up to much in prison in that terms, in terms of violence, or I doubt he's had loads of disciplinary problems. We certainly haven't heard of them. So he would be a candidate for parole. Now, what would go against him, of course, is that he's never accepted he committed the crime. So he can't display, even at this point, he can't display remorse for his criminal actions. He's persisted with the denial, despite all the overwhelming evidence. He's continued to insist he's an innocent man who's been wronged. That will stand against him. Obviously, then, at some point, somebody has to make a decision with guys like Joe O'Reilly, Joe O'Reilly, he's still, even all of these years later, he's still one of the most high profile prisoners in the state. A lot of those cases, they get forgotten about over time and people can seep out. But Joe O'Reilly still remains notorious. And therefore, it's going to be a point of public controversy when people like Joe O'Reilly or Brian Meehan.
And you see, that's the thing about Brian Meehan. Do we know other prisoners by name anymore that are serving as long? I'm just noticing there was a one of Ireland's longest serving prisoners was a guy called Bernard Dunn.
Yeah. I mean, he was.
Did we know anything? Did you know anything about him?
No, I mean,
heard of him.
No, I mean, I heard of him when he got out. If you know what I mean.
When he got out, but you didn't know of his existence before that. He served 36 years.
36 years.
Stabbed a pensioner to death in a public toilet.
Yeah,
and just randomly.
I think he was only 25 at the time, was he?
Back in 1985.
Yeah. So what happened with him would have been that he was regarded as being a threat to the public, and therefore he's not allowed out, even though his crime wouldn't be of the notoriety of the other people we've talked about. Obviously, there is the example of John Shaw, who...
Yeah, and he's still there.
He's still there.
How many years is he in? 40 or more?
Well, he definitely is Ireland's longest serving prisoner. I mean,
and one half of a serial killing duo. Jeffrey Evans died in more recent years, but the two of them had sort of I think they'd murdered two people, had they, in Ireland, and they had plans to murder a woman a week or something like this. They were going to travel around the country. I'm sure it was a phenomenal story at the time, and an extraordinary, random, strange kind of a story. But again, he isn't being let out because he's obviously still deemed a risk.
He's still deemed a risk. I suppose, they were regarded as Ireland's first serial killers. And they were definitely the most notorious people in the country in their day. They killed two women.
They were caught fairly quick.
Elizabeth Plunkett and Mary Duffy. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't particularly sophisticated crimes. There was all the stories then that they admitted their crimes and repented after being confronted by their actions. But John Shaw, I suppose, like Malcolm MacArthur, those killings were very random. They didn't seem to serve any purpose. It wasn't a crime of passion or even particularly motivated by money. So it was really shocking to the nation at the time. And they didn't seem to they seem to have those, certainly at the time, in the reporting at the time, and maybe things would be different now, they were regarded as being sort of psychopaths, I suppose, effectively. And John Shaw, while he has had some support from religious organisations that he's become involved with in recent years, he still isn't out.
So there's 360 plus, maybe 62, 61, whatever, life sentence prisoners in custody in the Irish system.
Yeah.
Most are in Wheatfield and the Midlands.
Yes. Most, like they're
362 of the population of what, 5,000? Prison population?
Yeah, something like that. Now that can go up and down. There'll be people convicted all the time. But and a lot of them, those names get forgotten about over time. And we hear, there will be people still. I mean, we had a story last year, Pat O'Connell did it for us, about a guy called Craig White, who was involved in one of the Crumlin Drimnagh shootings, and he was starting to get day release. I think it was after 14 years. So there is still people, and he was regarded as a model prisoner, though we did see him driving a car when he wasn't meant to. But so there are still people that get out quite quickly. But there are some of the people that the state just aren't willing to let go.
You must be seeing an enormous jump in the population of lifers in custody since, over the decades. Firstly, because of the rise of gangland gun crime. And secondly, because of the amount of people that are being convicted in relation to that now, that you don't actually have to be the person who does the killing. If you're part of an enterprise to murder somebody, you can be convicted.
Yeah, of course. And it was particularly hard to convict people of gangland killings 20 years ago.
And also, I mean, you go back to the 70s, you probably wouldn't have had, you could probably count the amount of kind of killings around organised crime throughout the 70s and maybe into the mid-80s.
Yeah, they were very rare.
And they start to grow then in the 90s.
Certainly the ones in the 90s, the rate at which they were solved was very, very low.
Yeah.
But the DNA and CCTV evidence has been a game changer in that way. Absolutely. So, I mean, the number of life sentence prisoners grows all the time. And And of course, then there is the situation for the prison services where you have people that are very old in prison. So there is, I think, a unit in the Midlands, one of the wings where people between life sentence prisoners and elderly prisoners, sex offenders, basically, it's described to me as it's just like being in a hospital.
A nursing home.
Just like in a nursing home, a hospital stroke nursing home where people are very, very unwell. I mean, the other side to that is that, we'll see it all the time, people in their 70s or even 80s being put into prison for historic sex offences. And that obviously puts pressure on the prison service in terms of resources, but it is often great comfort for the victims when people of that, even of that age, are finally brought to justice in their lifetime and are still sent to prison despite being unwell.
Okay, well, we'll leave it at that. Thanks, Niall.
Thanks, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.